what we look at in the book is how terrorism has affected the public across many different dimensions. So we look at, how does the threat of terrorism influence how individuals in society relate to each other? We look at how it affects their evaluations of political leaders. And then we also look at how it affects their relationships with other nations, right? So how do they think the U.S. should relate to other nations? So those are the three different levels that we look at in the book. So our main argument is that when people are experiencing times of crisis, so in particular terrorism, they look for ways to cope with the negative emotions that they experience. So one thing that they may do in terms of their relationship with other individuals is that they may become more distrustful of others in times of terror threat. And this is kind of similar to what you heard the administration saying after 9/11, which was, become more vigilant, look more closely at what others are doing. And so that's one of the arguments that we make. And the second is that they don't just become more distrustful, but that they become more intolerant, more negative toward outgroups in society, and not just those who people might associate with terrorism, such as Muslim or Arab Americans, but even other groups in society that have no relationship to the threat of terrorism. So, for example, potentially some immigrants or gays in society. We look at those different groups. So that's kind of how people relate to other individuals. We also look at the effect of terrorism on evaluations of leaders, and this takes up a pretty big chunk of our argument. So we argue that during times of terrorism, individuals not only look for strong and charismatic leaders, but they actually project leadership qualities onto certain political figures. So when we're looking at terrorism, obviously George Bush would be a prime candidate for projections of leadership qualities. But they don't only project leadership, but then when they go into the voting booth, they actually weight those leadership qualities more heavily than, say, their partisanship or positions on issues. So they, it's kind of a double whammy. They, there's some projection, but then they also vote based on those elevated evaluations. And then we also find that, elevated perceptions of leadership and charisma also come with further political benefits. So once a leader is in office, individuals are more willing to sacrifice their own resources for that leader. They're also more willing to forgive any policy mistakes by that leader, right? So once the leader's in office, if they start to make some, mistakes on different policy issues, they'll be less likely to blame that leader. And then finally, in some cases, they may even be more willing to give more authority to, say, an executive relative to Congress, and even preferences over democratic institutions may shift in times of terror threat. And then the final thing we look at in terms of relations with other nations, we argue that when people are faced with a terror threat, they're going to want to seal the border, protect the homeland. That's pretty intuitive. They also want to become more engaged with the world. So, for example, they will support a more interventionist foreign policy. Part of that might be more militant, part of it may be cooperating with other nations. So there could be some aspects that are more unilateral, some aspects that are more multilateral in terms of how we engage with other nations. So those are the general arguments that we make throughout the book in terms of the general structure.